After all the events of 1960, things that had happened, we had no more money. Ted gave up the idea of ever going back to college and joined with his brother, D.L., in the construction business. They called it Babb. They did exclusively homes for Wynn Homes, but they did all their building, and they were very successful, and they added a lot of new equipment. They bought planers and table saws, and Ted picked up a pickup for him to drive to work, which would leave me the car with the two children. As it was getting close to time for Teddy to be going to school, we actually had purchased a new home at 907 West Avenue M in San Angelo. And he would be going to school at Santa Rita, which was the same school that his dad had attended as a boy. Teddy had a great voice and a musical ear from the time he was little. He began to sing, babble, but stayed on pitch. And by the time he was 2 years old, he could sing, even though he couldn't pronounce all the letters. Hang down your head, Tom Dewey, hang down your head and cry. And lots of other little songs that he learned either listening to Captain Kangaroo on TV or that he heard at church or in our family songs. So we discussed that maybe he needed to take piano lessons. Ted said he'd go look and see what was going on. He came home all excited. He said, there is a 1922 Howard, made by Baldwin, player piano for sale. If we bought that, Teddy could practice on it, and I could play it, and you could play it, because it's got a motor on it to run the bellows, and they have piano rolls for sale too. So we decided to get that, and we bought it on a payment plan, $19 a month. So every month we took $20, made our payment, and bought one more roll because they were $1 each. And that added to our piano roll collection. Now, Teddy did take lessons for a little while from a teacher, and we really enjoyed the piano, and our other activities involved a lot at church, and one of those was a class we were in, a couples class called the Come Doubles. And in the Come Double class was like young married adults together. And we often hosted them at our home because they also liked to play our piano. And I think there's a picture of them all crowded around the back side of the piano one night. Well, things went on. Ted went to school. Alicia had had her surgery and got better. And but in the early 60s, the Cuban crisis came along under the first presidency of John Kennedy. And one of the couples in our Sunday school class, husband got recalled into the military. And they went to Colorado to be stationed there. And in the summer then, we decided to go visit them. It was really a first family vacation we'd had in a while. And it was Teddy and Alicia and Ted and I, and we drove in our Plymouth station wagon all the way up there. And Ted drove us on up to the top of Pikes Peak. It was June, early in June. It began snowing while we were on top of the mountain. And he had to drive us all the way back down that slippery mountain, and we didn't have chains on our tires or anything. It was pretty scary, but we made it. And while we were in Colorado, we also went to see a Santa village, which the kids enjoyed, and we visited Royal Gorge, and we also went to a reenactment of a cowboy show, which was fun. most of the activities at church were involved with that class, but also Ted became scoutmaster of Troop 2, which was sponsored by the First Christian Church in San Angelo, and Bob, his brother, became his assistant scoutmaster. And so for him, that was one night a week, scout meeting, and occasional weekends, campouts, and then at least a whole week in the summer to go for Boy Scout camp. He and Bob even took the scouts for a whole 2-week hike in the mountains at Philemont Scout Ranch near Cimarron, New Mexico one summer. So that was a great thing that he was interested in because he had enjoyed scouting as a boy. And when he was gone, I would be home with Alicia and the children. And once when I had the ladies of the group over for a Sunday, kind of a get-together for church ladies, and they brought their children, and they were playing. And my little climber, Alicia, decided that they needed some added refreshments. And unbeknownst to us, while we were in the living room and the children were playing in the bedroom, she made her way into the kitchen, climbed up either on a chair or the drawers to the top shelf of the cabinet and shared all the vitamins with the other children. When I was cleaning up the toys after they had all gone home, there was empty vitamin bottle. Oh my goodness, and I said, Alicia, what? And she said, candy. And she'd shared it to them that it was chewable like candy. So I called the doctor and he said, well, I don't think if there were several children that eating all of them, but they may have some yellow urine for a while. Then I had to call all the different mothers that had babies and tell them, watch out, just in case they might get a urine infection. Nothing came of it, but Alicia was using her climbing skills for that. One of the things that was interesting that I did was teach Sunday school. I helped a lady named Mrs. Chenoweth, who had taught 40 years in the kindergarten class. And she knew what she was doing, and I learned a lot from her. I did not know until her obituary that she had actually been the person who authored the kindergarten material for the U.S. military to use in all of their chapel Sunday schools around the world during World War II. Her husband, Dean Chenoweth, was one of our elders and also an editor at the newspaper. And he was fascinated with the way that Teddy could sing. And one Sunday, Teddy came home from church and he said, Mr. Chenoweth said if I would learn to sing A Balm in Gilead, he'd give me 50 cents because he really liked that hymn. So we looked it up in the hymnal and we found it and he learned it. And the next Sunday he came home proudly with 50 cents in his pocket because he had sung for Mr. Chenoweth. The other things that I did in church was that I sang in the choir. Sometimes in the soprano section, sometimes in the alto, depending on which one needed the singers. And often I was asked to sing a solo, especially at weddings. I did sing for my cousin, Bill McAnally's wedding. I sang for my brother Andy's wedding. I sang for my sister Linda's wedding. And oftentimes somebody from the church. I enjoyed singing, and I've done that all my life. And then near the end of our time there, I began, when Alicia got into first grade, I actually started a children's choir. She and Teddy were both in it. It was school-age kids, and we sang a special on a Christmas program. First time I put a medley together of Away in a Manger and Go Tell It on the Mountain, and that was well received at the church. Well, Dennis being a widower now after old Scout's death, we always had him over for supper at least one night a week. And he loved to come and see the kids and eat with us. And I would cook his favorite, pinto beans and cornbread. And I'd always make a double batch of cornbread to send home with him because he loved to put cornbread in milk for a bedtime snack. Living in the family home, Dennis always had chickens. He raised Rhode Island Reds from the time he was 12 years old, and he had the same bloodline. And he would buy champion birds and improve it. But it all started back when he was 12 in Arkansas. And he had won many awards himself for having the good chickens. He said after old Scout had died, maybe I'll take some chickens to the next stock show, just Fort Worth, just to see how I do, if I still know what they're looking for. And when he came home, he had the ribbons for the 5 best of all. 4 hens, each had won, and his rooster had won the grand champion of Rhode Island Reds and had won the grand champion of the whole roosters in all of the show, including the white leghorns and every kind. He had a triple ribbon from them. And he smiled and said, I still know what a good chicken is. He took those also to Oklahoma then and did some of that, which occupied some of his time as a widower, and he was happy with it. We even have ribbons that he won at the Waco Cotton Palace from 1912. And another thing that he did while he was, when he wasn't needed to trim out some of the houses there, he started raising some Shetland ponies. One of the ponies that he had was, he called it Whirlaway because it was so fast. It could run really fast, and they set up barrels on part of the land, and the girls around that had quarter horses and all would come to practice their barrel racing, and Whirlaway would practice, and there was a little sister to one of the girls that was learning to barrel race, and she would ride Whirlaway. And he was so fast that he would often beat the quarter horses. The trick was that being so little as a Shetland, he could round the barrels so much faster than they could. And he'd get ahead that way, and only if on that last straightaway they would catch him, because they had longer legs, would they beat him. One other thing he did as a widower, at times he would leave the house, cross the low water crossing on Bell Street, and go to a little cafe which was close to the cattle barn that had really good food. He'd drive himself over there to eat. And in the spring of 1966, we had rain. So the water was running over the bridge pretty stout. And he decided he could make it because he'd seen something else come across. So he started across, and as he got to about the middle of the ridge, he met an 18-wheeler coming the other way, and the water had backed up behind it, and it washed him off into the Concho River. It knocked him out when his car hit. But there was an airman who was waiting to cross, and he saw the wreck, and he got out of his car and dove in and pulled Dennis out. And we got a call, and Ted and his brother D.L., of course, rushed to the hospital. And he had a pretty good knot on his head, but he was alive. But that was early in 1966. Before all that happened, going back to our house that we lived in, we had good neighbors. One of the neighbors that we had next door were called the Mayrans. They had two little girls between Alicia and Ted in age. And Mr. Mayran was an accountant, and Ms. Mayran was actually an English girl that he had married as a bride when he was stationed in England with the military. So she didn't understand, excuse me, she didn't understand all of the American things, and so she would often come and knock on the den door, ask me a question about something. One night she knocked on the door, and Ted happened to be down with the TV out behind it, pulling out the tubes because the TV had quit working, and he was going to take them to a local place where he could test the tubes and see which ones were bad and repair the TV himself. And she said, "What is he doing?" And I explained all this to her. And so she said, "Oh, well, our TV has never gone out. It is a good TV." And then about 3 days later, she came over and knocked on the door, and she said, "You know, you told me about that. Well, our TV has gone out. Do you think your husband will come over and show my husband how to test the tubes?" And so that went along, and not too long after that, she was visiting, and I had brought in clothes from the line, and I said, "I don't know what we're going to do with that dog Tippy." I said, "He thinks he's playing a game with those clothes on the line when they blow in the wind. He's jumping up and grabbing them, and he's torn several of the things that belong to Alicia or Teddy that hang there." And she said, "Oh, my dog is a good dog. He never tears anything." And 2 or 3 days later, she knocked on the door and she said, "Today I went to the shopping center and I left my poodle in the car, and when I came back, he was eating my cashmere sweater. Oh, my goodness." And then I laughed. I said, "Well, it happens to everybody." About a week later, she came back and knocked on the door. I said, "What you need?" I just got to thinking, when you told me your TV went out, and I said ours never went out, then it went out. And when you told me your dog chewed on the clothes, and I said mine never did that, and then it did chew on my cashmere sweater. For God's sake, if you get pregnant, don't tell me. Well, in summer of 2024, not 2024, in the summer of 1964, I wasn't feeling well at all, and she said, "You don't look good. Are you sick?" I said, "I can't tell you." "You can't tell me? You're pregnant." I said, "That's right." And it was not an easy pregnancy either. I was anemic. I had to take medicine, iron by mouth. I had to take a B12 shot every week and eat liver twice a week. And my family, Teddy, and Alicia, did not care for liver that often. So I would make it and feed it to them one night a week, and then I'd save one piece to eat again later so that I had my 2 nights a week. Well, the baby was due October 31st. And at the end of that summer then, we needed to do something with the other 2 children, even though I had not felt well. And so we decided to take them to Six Flags over Texas. And we got a hotel room, and I was lying down in the hotel room resting while Ted took Teddy and Alicia to the swimming pool and also to the rides. When I felt a little better, I joined them, And I took a picture of Ted and Alicia on a little ride, riding around like a little seat that went around kind of like a swing. And she was enjoying riding with her daddy. Angela was born on November 8th of that year. Evelyn, Ted's sister, came and got Alicia and Teddy and took them to her house while I went to the hospital. And we went in about 5 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and around a little afternoon, she was born. She looked like a lot like Alicia had as a baby, with black hair and all. But she weighed 6 pounds, 7 ounces, and she was 21 inches long. She had lots of legs. But she was big enough, and we came home, and things went well. Ted went on with his scout meetings, and different things were happening until she got about 6 or 7 months old. And he and Ted and Teddy were gone on a scout weekend. Alicia and Angela and I were home together, and she was in a walker that had the legs on it and rolling around the den, and she rolled across a threshold from the den to one of the bedrooms and tipped over just that far, and a cry, and just a loud cry. And then I looked around and went to pick her up, and when I did, she was stiff and she wasn't breathing, and I thought, what's wrong? She didn't fall that far. There's not a mark on her. But I thought she was dying, and the thought went through my head, I'm going to have to call Ted and tell him that Angela's dead. And I don't know why. Finally, suddenly, the stiffness gave way, and she started breathing again. But she was like, not awake. But she was breathing. Found out later, because this spell began to happen every time she would get a quick intake of breath. If it was from a cry or from a fright or anything, and then she would get stiff and not breathing. And the doctor said she was having a larynx spasm, where her larynx was locking and not letting air through, but that she would probably outgrow it by the time she's 3 or 4 years old. Well, it was very traumatic when it happened. Even as she began to cut teeth, this would happen, and she would bite her tongue and it would bleed with a stiffness. I got to where when it would happen, I'd rush to her and stick my fingers in her mouth when she didn't have eye teeth, so she wasn't biting her tongue. And nobody wanted to take care of her because of that. We did have one lady that had a nursery at church, and since I was in the kindergarten room with Alicia straight across from the nursery, she would watch her and call me if I knew it was needed. She said she would come to the house and stay occasionally. Well, she didn't drive, so you'd have to pick her up and bring her and then take her back home, which we could do, but consequently, we didn't really go much of anywhere other than family. And mostly, they came to see us. Even though Angela had the larynx spasms, it didn't seem to affect her brain or anything. She didn't lose oxygen that long. In fact, she was very intelligent, and she jumped right in and tried to do what Alicia and Ted were doing. And she liked to listen to records that we had, and she would go and get a record and bring it to me and say, Baubles, Bangles, Beads. That was a song she wanted to listen to, Baubles, Bangles, and Beads. and it would be the right record. And I wondered how she picked it out, because they all looked alike to me. I had to really look at to know which one was which. They were all those 33 1/3 big records that you could play a lot of songs on, and I loved music, and I would play them a lot in the daytime. She also learned the names of the Indian chiefs from a book that was Ted Jr.'s, that Ted had used some in Scouts too, and also it was a present for Ted Jr. because he liked talking about the Indians and that sort of thing. And Angela, he would read it kind of and say something about them, and she'd sit and listen, and she got to where she'd say, Geronimo, and then she'd turn to Geronimo, or Sitting Bull, and she actually could tell that she knew the names. She just didn't speak that well, but she was only about 18 months old when this happened. So anyway, Mr. Chenoweth, who was one of the editors at the paper, heard me talking about it, and so they wanted to do a story on her. And turned out all three of my kids made the newspaper in that one year. Angela had the little article about her pointing out the Indian chiefs, and Alicia was picked in first grade, putting a Valentine on the bulletin board, and her picture came out at school. And then Ted Jr.'s picture was in there carrying the American flag at a Boy Scout event. So I was real proud of my kids, and they were all had good minds and were very friendly and joined into everything that you wanted them to do. 1966 came along. As I mentioned before, Dennis had that accident. Teddy and Alicia were in school now, and they were doing well, and Angela and I were fine at home. But Ted came home and he said, I'm really getting worried about my brother DL. Every day at work, he's reliving what went on in World War II. You know, he had been a Navy corpsman in the Pacific. And he said, he told me this story today about them in a small boat picking up survivors from a ship that had been torpedoed. And he said they were bobbing around in the water, and you pull one up and he's half eaten by a shark. You pull another one up and he's only got one leg and he's dead. And most of the bodies they recovered were dead. And he said we were getting them as fast as we could. And another day he said, today he told me about, they were on a ship to pick up some wounded, and the kamikaze plane was coming. And it was diving towards the ship, and the men were shooting at it from a gun turret, and it shot the plane, but the wing sheared off and came through and sheared off that gun turret. And DL said, I jumped down in there to tie the guy's legs off. They were cut off above the knee. And before I could get them all tied off, I was ankle deep in blood, Ted. And then he told another time about taking some men, wounded men, to a large hospital ship. And the doctor said, how long since you've had any rest, sir, young man? And he said, about 72 hours. I want you to lie down and sleep. And he said, but I need to get back to my ship to bring some more wounded. And he said, if you don't get a little rest, you won't be good to anybody. I will wake you, have them wake you in 45 minutes. I want you to go have 45 minutes sleep. And so he woke him up at that time, and he got on the little ship that took him back to his ship he was on. And as they were getting away, from there, that hospital ship was torpedoed, and they lost 1,000 doctors and nurses and 3,000 to 4,000 military men. He said, I think he's suffering from shell shock. Today, we would have known that that was PTSD. And yes, DL was suffering. On June 10th of 1966, Friday, Ted came home at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he said, we finished the house today. I said, well, great. I said, are you starting another one tomorrow? Surely not on Saturday. He said, no, I told DL, I need to mow my yard. Let's take a day off. And he said, well, I need to do some painting on the eaves of my house, so we'll take Saturday off, and of course we'll go to church Sunday. And by the way, Ted, you know, we had that hailstorm in the spring when the rain was so high that Dad washed over the bridge, that I got hail damage I need to fix. I need to do a new roof. So he said, so Monday and Tuesday, we're going to roof DL's house. Then Wednesday, we'll start the new house for Lloyd. So Saturday morning of the 11th, Ted was out mowing, and the phone rang. I answered the phone, and it was DL's wife, Carol. She said, get Ted quick. DL's in trouble. And so I ran out, and he was mowing, and I had to get his attention, and he shut the mower off. And I said, it's Carol on the phone. She said, DL's in trouble. So he comes rushing back to the house, and he said, he probably went to the warehouse, and he's cut his finger in a saw or something. And they both had type O negative blood, so they had always said if anyone needs a blood transfusion, they'd to give it to the other one. He got the phone, and he said, yes, Carol. And he turned white as a ghost. And he said, I'll be right there. And he hung up. And he looked at me, and he said, DL's in the hospital. He's had a heart attack. And he jumped in his truck and left. And I begun praying. All I could do. About an hour later, or hour and a half, he called me. And he said, he's gone. All that night, he sighed deeply. He couldn't sleep. I said, Ted, are you okay? And he said, I know what they mean by a broken heart, because my heart is broken for losing my brother. Well, Monday then, instead of them roofing the house, we had a funeral. And put DL away. And I had already been asked to sing at my brother's wedding on the coming Saturday. Ted said, you need to go on and do that for your brother. I didn't know if I'd be able to. But Tuesday morning, he got up and he put on his carpenter overalls, and I said, where are you going? I'm going to go roof DL's rent house. And so he did that, which took him 3 days instead of the two of them 2 days. So that's what he did Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, is roof DL's rent house. And then he said, I don't know what we're going to do next, because Carol's going to need the money that we've put in on this business, and we may have to dissolve it. So Friday night, I went to the rehearsal dinner, and Saturday, I sang at my brother's wedding. We left the children at home with the lady from the church came to stay with them. And during the reception, the church got a call from the preacher, and it said, "Your son Teddy says you need to come home. Angela's had a spell." And so we left the reception. But that week, from Saturday to Saturday, we buried one brother and married one brother. It was like Dennis lost all heart after that. He'd already lost his wife, and now he'd lost his oldest son. And by August, he was diagnosed with cancer. Started with a lump behind his ear. They removed it and said it was cancer. And then it was into his throat. And of course, he had smoked pipes all his life. But by October, early November, we had hired a lady that stayed at the house with him because he did not want to go in the hospital. He'd only go for treatments. He wanted to stay at home. And finally, in December, on a Friday, Ted went to see him after work and talked with him, and he said, "Ted, I think you better take me to the hospital." And so he did, and I checked him in, and he said, I'll be there in the morning. I'll be here in the morning. Well, he died during the night. And so Teddy, in the meantime, had been asked to sing solo at church on that Sunday, the 19th. And this was Friday the 17th when Dennis died. And people were calling, is he still going to sing? And the preacher called Ted, and he said, "I don't have a problem with him singing if he can. It'll be up to him because it's his grandfather." Ted was now 11 years old. And so the preacher asked him, said, "Teddy, are you still going to sing?" And he said, "Well, wasn't Dennis a Christian?" And he said, "Yes, he was." "Well, then I would like to do it, and I do it in honor of my grandfather." So on Sunday night, we went to church, and the house was packed, even the balcony. And he stood up there and sang "Sweet Little Jesus Boy." Ted looked at me and he said, "If he never does anything else right, I'll always love him for him doing this for my father." Well, there we were. We had lost D.L. and we'd lost Dennis within 6 months each. And Ted said, "I'm going to see what I can do about finding a job with someone else." Because he had to sell equipment and sell other things that they had bought together. And he was the cabinet maker, and Dennis had been the finish man, and they were both gone, D.L. and Dennis. And, when you buy a saw at that time maybe for $400, and it's used, you can only sell it for $200. But then if you give half of it to the other partner, you only get $100 out of it. And so things were kind of tight. But he found a job with a company out of El Paso that was looking for journeyman master plumbers and carpenters and all in the San Angelo area because they were building the buildings for the new San Angelo Central High School. And it is built like a college campus. It has a fine arts building. It has a English language arts building. It has a science building. It has different types of buildings. And Ted went to work for them, and knowing he had been a cabinet maker, one of the jobs they gave him was on the Sarah Bernhardt Theater, which was in the Fine Arts Building. He was assigned to do all the backdrop on the stage, and it had openings, kind of like a door opening with a curve at the top, that had special kind of cloth inside that would be good for sound reverberation. But the man said they estimated so much cloth, and he said, "It's going to be close, Ted. I don't know if it's enough or not. And how do you plan to do this?" And of course, Ted, teasing him, he said, "Well, I'll just do it like you do paper dolls. I'll just fold it and fold it and fold it and cut it out." I know it might not work that way. He laughed. He said, "I'll use my old thing that I always go with, measure twice and cut once, and I'll get it done." Well, it was a tight squeeze. He got all of those things done, and he came home and he said, "I finished, and I have 6 inches of cloth left," is all, the length of that. If he'd made one miscut, he wouldn't have been able to get them all done. One day, after work, when Ted got off there at Central, his friend Clayton Binge, that he'd met up in Lubbock, and who was now living in San Angelo and a math teacher, was there waiting for him. And he said, "Ted, I've done something I hope you'll be happy with." And he said, "What's that, Clayton?" He said, "Well, they're going to start a new building trades program in the vocational area of this new high school here next year." And he said, "I told him, I know exactly the person you need to get to do that. It's Ted Babb, because he's been a builder. He's wonderful at that. He's been a Boy Scout leader for nearly 10 years. He's great handling boys. He knows how to do that. And if you want to get that program off the ground, you'll hire him." And he said, "They told me for you to call and come in for an interview." And so he told me, he said, "I think I might just go interview and see what they say." And so he did, and he was hired. And then when September came, he started with his building trades class. And it was very successful. One of the things that one of the boys asked him when he asked if they had any questions, when he told them what they were going to do, he said, "I have a question, Mr. Babb." And he said, "What's that?" "Do you give spats?" And he said, "Well, I don't think that'll be necessary. You boys are juniors and seniors in high school, I don't think it'll be necessary." "Oh, good," and then laughed, And so what they did was on a lot that where Lloyd Wynn was opening a new development, they bought one of the lots. He had a certain amount of budget to run this class, and they constructed a house. They actually did from the ground up. They laid all the foundation. They did all that. He taught them the framing, the bricklaying, everything that goes into a house. And they had a plumber who came and worked with them and showed the boys about plumbing. But one day, after they had been working on the house, he went out to the bus that they had always rode from the school out to the the job site, and as he's starting to get in, he looked, and under the front tire, he saw this 16-penny nail standing up. And he goes and looks at the back. There, under every tire on the bus was a 16-penny nail leaned up against it, so that if he had started and either backed up or whatever, all tires would have gone flat. And so he said, I just didn't start the bus. I got the nails, and I pulled one out, and I came and lined the boys up, and I said, who did it? And they all looked kind of shocked, and then this one old boy, they had asked him if he gave spats. I did it, Mr. Babb. He said, I knew you didn't give spats, so it'd be all right. He said, well, when I said that, it was because I thought, a little talking or something that you might do in class. He said, this is a different situation. And so he said, come on, bend over. Okay, so he gave him a spat, and then he said, go to the next tire, bend over, pick up the nail, and he gave him a spat. He gave him a spat for every nail that he had put under a tire, and the old boy kind of made a believer out of him. And then, but he did say, I thought you weren't going to give spats, and he said, well, spats are reserved for something special. And then, about that time, our washing machine went out at home. It went out on the spin cycle, and it wasn't fixable. So he said, we'll get you a new washing machine. I'm not going to throw that one out there. I got something to do with it. So he hooked up a paddle to that thing, and he took that to school. And he said, having to give that spats hurt me just nearly as bad as it did whatever his name was. And he said, so I've changed my mind. I'm not going to give spats. I'll just give 1 minute on the spat board. And he turned on that washing machine, and that washing machine started spinning. He had that drum out there, and it was spinning around with that paddle on it. 1 minute on the spat machine. And he said he never had any trouble the rest of the year with any of the boys. Well, that was very interesting, and Clayton was one of our church members. And at the end of that year, another one of our church members, named Red Dooley, Mr. Dooley was a teacher at SAC and had known Ted through a class there as well as through the church. And he lived in the area where they were building this house and would come by every day and look. And he had taken pictures of progression of the house, and then newspaper articles about when they had the open house and showed it to the public. And by the way, it sold for cash on the first day of the open house, and they recuperated all the money for their budget for the next year for building trades. Well, he said, Ted, I've done something. I hope you'll be happy with it. And Ted said, well, what's that, Mr. Dooley? He said, well, I was in the class at A&M with Dr. Duggar. Dr. Duggar was the chancellor or president of Texas A&M. And he said, we've been corresponding, and he said, they have just been given by the state of Texas, this air base is going out in Waco, Texas, James Conley, and it's going to belong to Texas A&M for a vocational school. And they want to start a buildings construction program. And I told him, I know exactly the man that needs to start that program for you. And he's an ex-Aggie too. And so he said, I sent your name. And so he said, they're going to contact you. Well, Ted had been going to Austin for a 6 weeks class on learning to teach, which was something they said he needed to, even though he was okay for building construction, building trades, he needed to take classes on teaching. So he signed up for one in Austin for the first 6 weeks of the summer. Well, while he was there, a man came from Waco down there to visit him and said he was sent because they wanted to see if he was interested, and they'd like him to come and look over the campus and see where his building would be and all that sort of thing. So he asked me that weekend when he came home, what do you think about it? I said, well, Ted, if you want to, go look and see. So he goes and he comes back and he told me all about it, and it was like a warehouse that had been storage for supplies and things, and for the air base would be their shop where they could have their saws and all the stuff. And the front part could be very little trouble to make classrooms, and that could be some of their first learning things. And it kind of sparked his interest. And he said, I can have the building trades here in San Angelo again next year. I know that. But I thought it might be a challenge. And so I said, well, let's see what they do. Well, they called him back to interview with the president and all, and said then they liked him and they would bring it to their board of directors, and they would hear from him, because he didn't know how many other applicants he had or anything. Then he said to me, I have one other thing I need to ask you about this. And I said, what is that? And he said, would you be willing to move there away from your mother? And I said, well, Ted, when we got married, the vows said, love, honor, and obey. They didn't say, but always live in San Angelo. So I will go where you can make a living and are happy with your work and whatever happens. And he said, well, I've already thought about it and looking at our expenses here and the house payment. He said, to make it feasible for us to move, I think we have to get at least an offer of $8,000 for the teaching year. And I said, well, then let's pray about it and see and leave it in God's hands. And when he got the offer, it was $8,400, and we decided that it's what we were supposed to do. And so we made plans to move to Waco, Texas. That was going to be interesting also, because we were going to move into officers' housing, and we were going to have a 4-bedroom house with 2 baths and plenty of room for the children and playground and all, and a bus that took them to school. And so we were looking forward to it. And the only one that was not real happy about it was Angela. And she was already kind of alone, because the little Mayran girls had gone to school. Ted and Alicia had both been in school. And she said, had developed 2 imaginary friends. Their names were Candy and Sandy. And she said, but what about Candy and Sandy? And I said, oh, they'll be all right, Angela, So as we were moving, Ted was driving. We had a U-Haul truck taking all of our furniture that we were taking. Ted was driving a pickup loaded with bicycles and other things like that. And Alicia and Angela and I were riding in our station wagon with all of the clothes and stuff like that in the back. And Alicia said, guess what, Mom? I said, what? She said, Sandy and Candy are moving to Waco too. I said, oh, they are. She said, yes, Angela said, they're in the car right behind us. They're following, they're moving there too. So I told Ted when we stopped for gas, I said, guess who's moving to Waco with us? And he said, who? And I said, Sandy and Candy. He said, oh my goodness. This was in Brownwood. And so later when we got stopped, I think at the Dairy Queen to get an ice cream, Ted said, Angela, I'm really sorry, but when we got to Goldthwaite and we made that turn towards Waco, Sandy and Candy's car went on to Austin. So I guess they're going to Austin instead, you know. So she never talked about them until later after school started one winter when she was so bored. She said, did you hear the doorbell, Mom? I said, no. I think there's somebody at the door. And she goes, Mom, it's Candy and Sandy. They've come all the way from Austin to play with me today. So it was interesting. Well, our next life begins in Waco, Texas.